Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we're going to be running through the F1 Academy season opening races. Now, before we dive into the races themselves, the key moments and what they mean for the rest of the season, who to look for, and all of those types of things, I do want to talk a little bit about the weight of where we chose to have the opener and what it meant. Now, the season opener for the F1 Academy races took place in Saudi Arabia as a support race for the F1 Saudi Arabia GP. One of these races also took place on International Women's Day, and the thing about them being held in Saudi Arabia that really held a lot of weight for me was the fact that in 2018, just 6 years ago, women were just granted the right to drive at all. That decision was made in 2017, and the first driver's licenses were actually issued to women in 2018. Now, 6 years after that, we have an entirely female series running on that track. And while there's a lot to be said about what can still be done to support women in this sport, what it looks like when they actually make it to the top, and whether or not they'll be welcomed and supported, I did want to take a moment to take in the weight of how far we've come in just 6 years. Additionally, the wildcard racer here, Rima Jafali, is Saudi Arabian. She was actually the first Saudi Arabian female racing driver, and just a year after she became that first female driver, she also became the first Saudi Arabian woman to compete in an international racing series in her own country. She obviously continued to do so and was the wild card this weekend. And I definitely want to jump into the races themselves, which we're about to do now, but I just wanted to take a moment and put that into our kind of frame of reference. The F1 Academy series is a big deal for women. It's a big step for women in motorsport, and there's a lot of promise of what's to come, but I think I really just wanted to take a moment and put it into perspective. 6 years ago, women could not only not race on this track, they couldn't drive at all in Saudi Arabia. And with everything going on, I thought it was a really nice moment. So I just wanted to take a moment and point out like how far we actually have come. I think a lot of times when we're pushing towards success, we're pushing towards like this larger goal of women being successful in motorsports. It's easy to miss these sort of smaller milestones that are actually pretty big in their own right. 6 years ago, women did not have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. And 6 years later, on International Women's Day, 16 young women hit the grid to race against each other. I don't know about you, but for me, that's pretty exciting. Now let's get into the races themselves because there's one major headline from this weekend, and that is Doriane Pin. I've already seen a number of articles come out with variations of the same title. Does F1 Academy have a Max Verstappen problem? Now, those headlines might be confusing if you didn't watch the race weekend. They're not saying that Max Verstappen is a problem for F1 Academy, but they're actually saying that Doriane Pin is so dominant, she's starting to resemble Max Verstappen's dominance already this early in the season. Now, if you didn't listen to the F1 Academy primer episode that I did, I would recommend going back and listening to that because I think some of the basics of how the series works are pretty important to understand what happened this weekend. So if you haven't listened to that episode, wherever you're listening now, I would recommend pausing this one and going back to the F1 Academy primer. It's called Formula 101 F1 Academy Primer. Did you do it? Did you listen to it? Are you ready to talk about Formula 1 Academy? Wonderful. Here we are. Now that I know you know the rules of how F1 Academy works, I will give you a small refresher. There are 2 races for the weekend, but qualifying takes place only one time, which means that your first fastest lap is your qualifying time for race 1, and your second fastest lap is your qualifying time for race 2. Doriane took pole for both races. So heading into this race weekend, she already had 2 points just for taking pole for each race. So heading into these races, she actually already had 2 points to kick the season off, which are awarded for taking pole in any race. But from lights out to the finish line, Doriane was completely dominant in these races, which actually meant that between both races, it was sort of like watching an F1 race when we're talking about the dominance of Max Verstappen. The front of the field was just Doriane going for a joyride and Abby pulling right behind her, trying to put up a really good fight. But one of the things I loved about watching this race, and I think we're going to see throughout the entire season, was how intense Doriane and her team are about winning everything. Towards the end of the race, they broadcasted a radio message from Doriane's team, basically saying, look, you're going to win the race. We know that. However, Abby Pulling has the fastest lap by about 400ths of a second, so we're going to need you to push. Taking pole and winning the race was not enough for them. They also wanted that fastest lap, which ultimately they didn't get. Abby did have that fastest lap in the first race, which I think is actually exciting because it means that we're going to see her continuing to push and make Doriane a better racer and herself. But ultimately, I will be honest, watching that front of the field was a little boring. We had those 2 drivers at the front of the field pushing each other, but there was a pretty big gap between the 2 of them and the rest of the field, and ultimately seeing one driver run away with a race can be kind of boring. But to be honest with you, it was exciting to see Doriane be such an intense talent, and even more than that, I actually really loved watching the coverage that came out of it. We're seeing people talk about a young female racer and comparing her to Max Verstappen in terms of dominance, in terms of success, in terms of how much further ahead of her peers that she is. That is really exciting to me. Those are the types of things and headlines that we need to see for people to start getting more comfortable with the idea of women racing, to believe that there is this much talent. I would kind of liken it to the way we're seeing people talk about Caitlin Clark. Ultimately, to me, I would always say that women's basketball has been exciting and thrilling to watch, and especially women's college basketball. But we're seeing Caitlin Clark get all of this press because she is building through these records. She's having a very dominant era, and she is getting enough of a press media frenzy to get people excited about going to the games. And ultimately, that's very good for women's basketball. That's very good for women's sports, for it to be focused on one person who is enough of a star, has enough star power to get people excited about it. With the reaction to Doriane's dominance this weekend, I think we're going to see something really similar when it comes to F1 Academy and Doriane's racing. I saw a ton of major podcasts, news outlets, and content creators that normally only cover Formula One talking about this insanity that was Doriane. And I think ultimately, while it may be more boring to watch the front of the field be this dominant, it's ultimately good for the sport to have someone who is that exciting, that dominant, and that headline inducing. I think she has the star quality we may need to see for people to get excited about this series and to get excited about women in racing overall. Plus, listen, it was a great drive. She did a great job this weekend. It was clean, it was smooth, it was fast. It looked like someone who really knew what they were doing out there. And I will say that Abby Pulling put in a ton of performance to prove that she is going to kind of compete. She's not going to just take it lying down. Now let's talk a little bit about further down the field. At turn 13, we had a bunch of corner cutting. Some of those were caused by lockups, some of those were caused by driver error. We saw two drivers have to give position back for passing off the track. Generally, we did see a bit of corner cutting and kind of going off track and gaining positions this weekend, but I think that's by nature of these drivers getting comfortable in the track, getting comfortable in the cars. My blind bet would be that as we continue through the season, we'll see a lot less of this. Overall, we only had a couple of DNFs in the first race. For Jess Edgar, I would say that that situation was not really her fault. She had a tire puncture and it wasn't even really the fault of the other driver that she collided with. It was more of just like a racing incident, you might say. And then unfortunately, we did have Leah Block hit a DNF as well after hitting the curb. And then post-race penalties are another big conversation this weekend. In race one, I would say that the penalty was actually very warranted. Lola Lovenfoss, who's racing under the Charlotte Tilbury brand, had a 10-second penalty for causing a collision with Nira Marti, who's racing for Tommy Hilfiger. That collision definitely was her fault, and it also ended Nira's race. It's always frustrating when you see those, when you have a collision that is not the driver's fault that ends their race, especially when the other driver continues their race on. So I would say that that 10-second penalty in race one for Lola was definitely warranted. And at the end of race one, we saw obviously Doriane Pin take the win, Abby Pulling take second, and Maya Woog take third. I was excited to see Chloe Chambers right behind them in position 4 because, to be honest with you, I am excited to see two American drivers on this grid. Chloe's one of them, and I think we're also seeing a lot of newcomers at the top of this race, which is very exciting. The first race of the series, which was race 1 of this weekend, was honestly a great kickoff. Most of the racing was pretty clean. We saw Doriane very dominant for most of the race, but we also saw Abby Pulling show that she could be a contender and she could challenge her for the rest of the season, and everyone put in some pretty good times. It was a fun race to watch. I also honestly really loved that we ended the race on a radio message from Doriane Pin's engineer saying, "Huge congratulations and happy International Women's Day." So overall, I think we saw some exciting racing in race 1, but we also started to understand that we're going to see some dominance from Doriane, with maybe Abby Pulling kind of pushing up behind her. Race 2, however, was maybe a little bit more controversial. The biggest headline from race 2 is the fact that Doriane Pin, who won the race, crossed the checkered flag twice. What that means is that after the race finished, she continued to go for 2 laps at full speed. Ultimately, the argument is that this is a dangerous situation. Everyone else is slowing down and you are going probably exceedingly fast. You're trying to speed up because you think you're still racing. It seems that her team didn't tell her that the race was over. It also seems that she missed the actual checkered flag itself as a driver, and the choice of the penalty was a 20-second penalty after the race was over. That 20-second penalty dropped her all the way down to 9th for the second race. Now, here's the thing that I think is hard. Do I think the penalty was overkill? Yes. Absolutely. A 20-second, 8-place grid drop for something that did not actually cause any sort of problem, crash, or injury seems pretty out of this world to me. This is also a series that is meant for people to be learning, to gain experience, to make mistakes ultimately. And so I think something as minor as this, which to me really is minor, nothing happened, a 20-second penalty really just feels like overkill. All of that being said, on the flip side, the one thing that I do kind of struggle with to say that this is completely wrong or completely ridiculous is that we saw that the stewards at the F1 race the same weekend really had some egregious penalties as well. They were handing them out left and right, and during the race, some of those penalties changed the entirety of the race itself. Kevin Magnussen had pretty much gotten a 20-second penalty during the race and determined that his race was kind of over. So instead, he drove completely defensively for Nico Hülkenberg, which allowed Haas to actually score a point. The point that I'm making here is that I think one of the things that's hard is that we keep saying we want these series to be taken seriously. We want women's racing to be taken seriously. And to some degree, I would say that we actually saw the same level of egregious penalties for Doriane that we were seeing in the actual F1 race. So ultimately, I would say that both F1 and F1 Academy this weekend had penalties that were way above the standard of what they should have been. But I guess the question is, does it feel like maybe it's important for us to see the same level of ridiculousness in penalties or the same level of seriousness that the stewards are taking the racing when it comes to F1 Academy as we're seeing in F1? Like, is it actually important for us to take this penalty with Doriane and have the moment on the internet where we're all reacting to how egregious it feels? where we're saying, oh, she didn't deserve that. That was way too much. Does that actually feel like we're taking this series just as seriously as we're taking the other racing? I don't know. I am frustrated that Doriane had this egregious level of a penalty for something that ultimately had no consequence to the race or to anybody's safety. But on the flip side, I am kind of happy that we're taking women's racing seriously enough to have a situation where we're all upset about a penalty that feels too high. Part of me thinks that like we need both. And also, to be honest, it's actually really exciting to see so much of the community get excited and outraged over a penalty in this series. I think just from this penalty alone, we've already seen so much more coverage and excitement surrounding the F1 Academy series than we did last year. So I would say my ultimate take on this 20-second penalty for Doriane: frustrated by it, egregious, but also kind of excited by the reaction to it from the general public. The other two penalties we had in this race were Amna Alkabasi, who had a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining a lasting advantage, which, as we saw in race 1, was also a consistent issue across the board. Many people had to give their position back, and again, this one we saw that she didn't give the position back, got the 5-second penalty, pretty standard and obviously earned. But the other one we had was actually Lola. Lola caused another collision in this race, and to be honest, this one I thought was just completely out of line. It felt like a rookie mistake or an intentional crash. She had a small collision, which was not the collision she was awarded the penalty for, which ultimately led to her being spun out and she needed to re-enter the race. Rather than wait for everyone to pass and re-enter the race safely, she slammed on the gas and drove directly into Leah Block's path. Leah was going way too fast to be able to have done something about it defensively, especially because Lola was coming out sideways, so basically like perpendicular to the racing line. That crash was pretty gnarly, and Lola was actually not awarded a time penalty in the race, but was awarded a 5-grid penalty for the next race. After penalties, we saw Doriane drop down to 9th, which meant that Abby Pulling was promoted to 1st, Maya Woog was taken to 2nd, and Nira Marti took 3rd. And after the penalties have been awarded, we now see our driver standings end in a similar situation as the first race. Abby Pulling is in 1st, Maya Woog is in 2nd, and Doriane Pin is frustratingly in 3rd. Though I will be honest with you, I do not think it's going to be many races before we see her in 1st again. What I will say about this weekend is that I really think that it kicked this series off in a way that we can all be so excited about it. There was an extreme amount of press, an extreme amount of coverage. The races were broadcast live wherever you were watching the F1 races. Plus, they were also streamed free on YouTube and Twitter. There is an extreme amount of accessibility to watching this series. There's an extreme amount of press coverage being handled by this series. Content creators, podcasters, newscasters, everyone is covering it. We also saw a number of the F1 drivers supporting these races. There were social media posts. The F1 drivers visited the F1 Academy paddock. Some of the F1 Academy drivers were invited into the garage to see the car, to talk to those drivers. We're seeing these girls get a lot of FaceTime with major drivers. We're seeing these girls get a lot of press. And on top of everything, Lewis Hamilton actually showed up to the podium for Doriane Pin to congratulate her, to watch her take that trophy. Unfortunately, when we are trying to see the success of a group being uplifted, a lot of times that requires the people who are in the positions of power to show up and to put their support behind that series, behind those people. We're seeing that. I was so excited to see Lewis there. I think so many people were excited to see Lewis there. I know Doriane was excited to see him there. There's just a level of class that comes from it, I think. And there's a level of press that comes associated with anywhere that Lewis goes. So I think it's a big deal. I hope you guys watched the race because I thought they were really fun to watch. But if you didn't, you can watch any of the F1 Academy races on replay on YouTube. You can also watch qualifying, you can watch free practice, and you'll be able to do that for their next race in Miami as well. But I would actually really love to know what you guys thought about the race. You can tell me by finding me on social media at Marissa Kamari on all platforms. But you can also join the Grid Chat. I host a group chat of motorsports fans where fangirling is encouraged, and there's no such thing as a dumb question. We also watch the races live together, which is really fun. And of course, throughout the week, we share memes and news. If you would like to join that group chat, you can go to tandonproductions.com/gridchat and fill out the form there. Once you do, you will get an email from me with a link to join the chat. If you're listening to this podcast on Herd FM, you can find me in the community section at Marissa. If you follow me there, I will follow you back and we can talk as soon as you finish every episode of the podcast. And no matter where you're listening to this podcast, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, turn on your notifications for this podcast, and make sure that you're not missing an episode of Grid Chat. This was a very full weekend of racing, so the next episodes will be about the IndyCar opener in St. Pete. And if you listen to the last episode where James Coker joined me to talk about the race recap for the F1 race this weekend, we also recorded a little bit more of our conversation talking about how he became a content creator, how he's gotten to work with Formula E drivers and Sports Illustrated, and how you can do the same if you are interested in following that path. So all of those things are coming up soon. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening now and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any of those episodes. Until then, I've been your host, Marissa Tandon, and thank you so much for joining the Grid Chat.